And just the cultural gap between them and someone who's probably significantly older than them, probably much more experienced, senior executive, with a very different perspective on the world. Even before the two of them start trying to talk to each other about data, they probably don't have that much in common in some ways. I don't think we should start from a completely negative perspective that advertising is somehow very problematic in the UK. We actually have a very robust system. But that said, there are problems. How do you monitor disclosure? Again, you have to start to bring some degree of AI and machine learning into this because the amount of content is so huge. I've definitely seen situations where data is used almost to apportion blame.
Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Sam Knowles. And joining us today is Adam Davidson, the head of data science at the Advertising Standards Authority. In the past 3 years, Adam's grown the data science function from himself to a team of 7 and still growing. Using a combination of artificial intelligence and machine learning, he's led the development of the ASA's pioneering active ad monitoring system, which we'll cover, I'm sure, in some detail during our conversation today. But Adam's route to the advertising industry's regulatory body has been by no means linear or predictable, aside from the fact that every role he's inhabited, every organisation he's helped to shape and transform has been delivered thanks to his love of using data to solve problems. Indeed, a decade ago, Adam was a postdoctoral researcher in the high-energy physics group at the University College London, working on the ultimately successful search for the Higgs boson at the Large Hadron Collider. From CERN, he became the lead data scientist for Qubit, developing software-as-a-service tools for online retailers. And before joining the ASA in 2021, Adam spent nearly 6 years as head of insight and data science at The Economist. It's great to have you with us, Adam. Now, I trust that was a good summary of who you are and what you do. Is there anything that you'd like to add? Anything I've got wrong?
No, absolutely. Yeah, it's nice to be reminded that it has been quite a varied journey. I've been lucky in my career to have an opportunity to work in so many different sectors and see how things work in different types of organisations.
Well, brilliant. It's fantastic to have you with us today. Now, and I think we will inevitably focus on data, but before we do, I wanted to start with the question that's designed to get to the heart of what makes you, you. And it doesn't necessarily ask you to tell us about your work. So tell me, Adam, how do you spend your time?
How do I spend my time? Well, I suppose it's quite an easy one. I have 2 small children at home who are 2 and 6. So I think in practice, all of my time that's not spent thinking about data at work is probably spent managing family-related things at home. To be honest, that probably sums things up pretty well.
Very good. Now, listen, the first time I saw you talk about data was on BBC TV's flagship science programme, Horizon. And I was struck when I was sent a copy of that programme, how incredibly clear you are as a data storyteller. And you're dealing with something that is well beyond my ability to understand the Higgs boson. And yet I came away from that feeling that I really did understand. Can you tell us about the work that you did at UCL and working at CERN?
Yeah, absolutely. I was really lucky. I've been lucky many times in my career to sort of have the opportunities that I've come across, and I was lucky in that I was finishing university and ended up doing a PhD in high energy physics at UCL, and happened to be working on the Large Hadron Collider at the time that it turned on. There were many people who'd been there for sort of 20, even longer years, and to waiting for this moment. And I got to sort of walk in at the time when data started coming out of the machine, and we got to do all the really interesting analysis and start trying to discover things, the search for the Higgs boson and so on. And yeah, it was a really fascinating place to be. And I guess, when a lot of people think about high energy physics, they think about, being in the lab, maybe you're working with complicated machines, but actually the way almost all modern physics happens is it's a huge amount of data analysis. All the sort of the easy, small experiments have happened now. The things that really probe the highest energies, the fundamental nature of the universe, rely on, big machines, large scale, huge amounts of data, complicated statistical analysis. So, my role as a PhD student and then latterly as a postdoc was to analyze some of the data that was coming out on the machine, as part of a very large collaboration with hundreds of other people doing the same things. And I was lucky to be part of that at that moment where the discovery of the Higgs boson happened, which was fascinating, both because it was a really interesting piece of work, understanding the fundamental nature of the universe, but also because it really captured the public imagination. It was this moment where high energy physics was very much in the news, and you could sort of, there's probably not many times in the history of physics where you could have talked about a cutting edge experiment down the pub and have people go, oh yeah, I know, I'm really interested, I know exactly about that, I've seen about it on TV. So that was really gratifying experience as well, to be able to sort of like have your work connect with people on that level.
Now, as I've already suggested, your move from being a particle physicist to advertising regulation is not necessarily the most obvious. It's not that it's not you can't fill in a careers form to go from A to B. Could you describe your journey over the past decade and explore a little more this constant drumbeat in your career of making smarter use of data?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess I left physics and went into data science sort of 12 or so years ago now. And that was a period where data science was a new phrase in industry. There weren't that many people doing it. And because it was new, there wasn't really an established career path. So a lot of people my age who got into data science did it by doing a PhD in something unrelated and just sort of happening to fall into it, get to the end of your PhD, not sure what to do. In my case, I did a couple more years as a postdoc. But, at some point you decide that maybe the career prospects in academia aren't there for you, or it's just you want to change, whatever it is, and you find yourself. We found ourselves falling into these data science jobs in industry, and it was very lucky because having not gone into the PhD with any expectation that it would create opportunity for me, I did it because I was really interested in physics. But when I got to the end of that bit of academic work, I found that the skills that I'd learned in that process were suddenly very much in demand in industry, that there were lots of companies that were looking for people who knew how to write code to analyze really large data sets. And that's exactly what I've been doing. So what I found was that surprisingly, the difference between PhD high energy physics research and working in e-commerce was not as big as you might expect for a data scientist, that actually the sort of the skill, although the data comes from a different place, the day-to-day, the things that you're doing, the skills that you needed were the same. And so for me, I found that transition much easier than I expected it to be. I realized that I was someone who really enjoyed problem solving. I really enjoyed working with data. And more than that, I enjoyed turning data into action somehow, right? So not just the process of looking at the numbers, but how can I do a piece of analysis? Yeah, I can feel good about the fact that I've done something clever and I've turned these numbers into something. But for me, how do I then make that into some kind of action? How do I turn that into something useful for someone that they're going to use to take decisions or whatever? And so I made this transition into industry in that sort of search for a different way to apply my skills. If I'm completely honest, then not at the time for any sort of grand planning, because I didn't know what I was looking for, just through sort of seeing what was available, me going for an interview, quite liking the people, taking the job, and then, and going from there. But yeah, so I think that sort of summarizes my career really, is that I've always liked that process of working with the data, finding ways to do innovative stuff with it that turns into something that's useful. And I've been very lucky. I think it's a really lucky aspect of working in data that those skills are very transferable between different sectors, which gives you that opportunity to change. And I found that really valuable because, just sort of the culture of how different organizations operate, the things that you learn from working with different people, you always pick up new ideas, new ways of doing things that then, that take you forward. They change your way of thinking about things and make you better at your own job. So yeah, it's been a really interesting process, and yeah, I've been lucky enough to do academia, startup, a publisher, and now into regulation. And I've always enjoyed. Every time I've changed, I've really enjoyed it. Basically, I found that I've learned new things, but still applying the same set of skills.
Now, I describe myself as a data storyteller. Indeed, on the morning of the day that we're speaking, I've been training people from many different sectors, but largely communicators, some data scientists. But I've been training them, and one of the things that strikes me, having spoken to you before, and you speaking now, is your passion to not just to do the data analysis, not just to crunch the numbers and say so what, but to move from so what to now what. This is what we should do as a result, and also to explain that in a way that genuinely inspires action. I was talking to an old friend the other day who kind of he works largely with big global retailers, and he says that the challenges that he faces in these large global retailers is that the leadership asks unanswerable questions, and that the data scientists give generally incomprehensible answers that the leaders could never understand. And we were talking about, well, we really need to develop the Babelfish or an interactive phrase book to put into the ears of the marketing director or into the mouths of data scientists. Can you explain how you bridge that sometimes unbridgeable gap? Because often organisations will invest a huge amount, rock star salaries in data science teams, who are then sort of siloed off and do their own thing and never really influence the growth of the organisation.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think it's a huge challenge, and I think there's a few different problems that organisations have that I've seen. I think you have the sort of the dual challenge that often you have because sort of data science is a relatively new field. You often have relatively young people who don't have a huge amount of experience of operating in a corporate environment, and just the cultural gap between them and someone who's probably significantly older than them, probably much more experienced, senior executive with a very different perspective on the world. Even before the two of them start trying to talk to each other about data, they probably don't have that much in common in some ways. And then on top of that, you have the issue that often a lot of senior executives have experienced most of their career in a world where quantitative insight data was probably a much smaller part of what they were doing. So they don't have that reference back to, when I was doing the sort of the work, that's how we use data. So there is definitely a sort of a cultural gap often to bridge, not always. And I think over time this is changing as more and more people come through with a more quantitative mindset in organizations. But there is definitely a gap. I think, it's a cliche, but it has to go both ways for it to succeed. You have to, data scientists, and part of the maturing of data science as a field is for data science, leaders within data science to develop their skills in terms of how to communicate things in an actionable way and how to influence. I find this really fascinating that in some ways, to me, I feel the technical problems in data analysis are solvable. They're easy. I always think that the hard problem is the social problem, is how do you convert the clever thing that you've done with the data into something that somebody can make use of? How do you communicate it in a way that inspires action, inspires someone to take a decision? And often that is really hard because there's so much complexity, there's so much nuance, and you as the analyst, you've spent time crafting this thing, but the other person doesn't understand that. You have to find a way to communicate. I find that to be a fascinating problem. I think the other challenge that a lot of organizations have is that often what the data tells you isn't what you want to hear as well. So actually, I think sometimes in organizations we'd love to believe that we were really objective in the way that we make decisions, but actually it's not. It's often quite a complicated process to get to decisions. Being scientific, the data doesn't always tell people what they want to hear, but also it's not always the only factor, right? So working out how to combine that data into a sort of a more holistic view of what the right thing to do is, that's quite hard, So I think there's this gap that needs to be bridged from both sides trying to understand how to speak to each other. But I think also, there are genuinely hard problems here. We've got data, it tells us this, but it's not perfect. It's got gaps here and there. This other source of qualitative data is telling us something different. If we go this way, there's risk. Balancing all that stuff up is a genuinely difficult problem as well, in my opinion.
I agree, and but I do get a sense. I mean, I do get a sense that, and we'll come on to talk about now about what you're doing, what you've managed to affect. But I do get a sense that not that data science has come of age. I think data science has been of age for many years. It's just that many organisations haven't realised how to tap into it. But I do get a sense that this lost in translation phenomenon is not receding over the horizon, but things are getting better in many organisations. Now, thinking of online advertising, it's often described as the Wild West. I remember in the maybe about 10 years ago, Mark Pritchard, still I think Procter and Gamble's chief marketing officer. I think he's still called that. Maybe he's chief brand officer now. Described at Cannes Festival of Media, described online advertising as murky at best, fraudulent at worst. And Keith Weed is then his opposite number at Unilever, using a rather Trumpian phrase, said it was time to drain the swamp at a similar meeting. Can you explain the challenge that the Advertising Standards Authority faces in keeping tabs on this sector, both in terms of the kind of the job to be done and also just the sheer scale of it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the first thing I would say is that advertising, even online advertising, is regulated in a number of ways, not just by the Advertising Standards Authority, but by a number of statutory bodies. For example, financial advertising is regulated by the FCA. And the vast majority of online advertising actually is fine, right? If you scroll through your news feed on your favorite social media app, most of the stuff you see will be completely fine. So I don't think we should start from a completely negative perspective that advertising is somehow very problematic in the UK. We actually have a very robust system. But that said, there are problems, and scale is a huge challenge that comes with online advertising. 20, 30 years ago, when the ASA was focused much more on print, radio, TV, things like that, the volume of advertising was simply much smaller. It made proactive regulation much easier. I think we're very clear that you cannot be an effective regulator of online advertising unless you know what is happening in online advertising. That's the core challenge. Unless you know what people are seeing, how can you be proactive? How can you regulate effectively? And when you look at the fact that there are, I don't have an exact figure, but there are probably millions of ads live in the UK today that will be seen by people. And that's clearly not a volume of content that you can tackle in any way without bringing some form of artificial intelligence, or machine learning, automation to bear on the problem. So that is the challenge we have, is how can you regulate effectively without understanding what's happening? And that's where we've put in place our data science capability and the work we've done on our active ad monitoring system to put in place a system that allows us to capture ads at scale, process them, make sense of them, and start to turn them into intelligence that's beginning to more and more drive the decisions that we make, the projects that we run, and how we regulate in general.
Before we go into a bit more detail on that, when you talk about when you say you have to know what people are seeing, that's because not everyone who listens to this podcast works in marketing or indeed in data. But I just wanted to clarify something there. When you say what people are seeing, you mean both the content and the context. So kind of alcohol ads being served on teenage girl fan sites is not going to be. But you're looking for both what it is and also where it's appearing, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the majority of the work we do focuses on content, because often the way that an ad can break the code is by saying something. The easiest way to mislead a consumer is to say that your product does something that it doesn't, right? The context isn't important. If your ad is misleading, it's misleading. But absolutely, there are lots of cases where we care about context as well. And, you highlighted sort of inappropriate content being shown to under 18s is definitely one of those examples. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, can you tell? I mean, when we spoke before, I said I don't want you to give away your secret sauce, and you said, "Well, actually, I've got nothing to hide." To be honest, the more people know, the better. But tell us about a little bit more, if you would, about the active ad monitoring system, kind of what it does, how it works, and how it's shifting the balance. I mean, I was really interested in the comment you made, shifting the balance of the ads that you monitor, evaluate, and ultimately take down if they are contravening the codes.
Yeah, I mean, let me give a really concrete example of the kind of work that we do in the data science team here at the ASA. So a few years ago, we helped on a piece of work in the ASA's climate project. Very important area for the ASA is climate claims. We're very keen to simultaneously prevent consumers from being misled by greenwashing, while in parallel not preventing businesses that are making positive changes from talking about the positive changes that they are making, because in some ways, if we go too far, then actually that's detrimental for consumers. Well, we'll discourage businesses from trying because they can't talk about what they're doing. So getting the balance between those two is really important for us. A couple of years ago, we supported the team on a piece of work around airlines making statements about sustainability in relation to flights. And there were some quite high-profile rulings that came out as a result of that basically say that generally speaking, airlines shouldn't claim that flying is sustainable, because generally that's a very difficult claim to support. Now, what we would have loved to do after that is follow up and see, is everyone listening to the rules or not? But actually, when you look into airline ads that are running, there are tens, if not hundreds of thousands of ads running on search services, social media, things like that. There's clearly no way that the experts in that team could possibly hope to stay on top of this and make sure there's no problematic claims. So a project that we've worked on since then and continue to do is the active ad monitoring system is set up to capture from social media, search, programmatic display, as many sources as we can reach, any ad that is run by a UK airline. Then there are machine learning algorithms in place that will look through all of those ads for anything that looks like a sustainability or climate-related claim. It will then filter those down, pull out the ones that look relevant. We'll put those into a web interface where they get passed over to an expert in the relevant team, and we will then say, please have a look at these. The expert will look at them. In a lot of cases, they'll say, actually, that one fits within the rules. They've said this, but it's not directly a claim of sustainability, whatever. But then there are other cases where they say, all right, that is something that we need to take action on, and then it goes from there. So that's a really concrete example of the kind of work we're doing and how it's enabling a type of regulation that simply isn't possible without that kind of AI automation element. And of course, AI isn't perfect at assessing these things, but we've turned the problem of scanning 100,000 ads to a problem of looking at 100, which now an expert can do, even if only 10% of those are relevant, then that's fine. And actually, the other angle of this is, as well as finding some problematic ads that we wouldn't have found otherwise, we've been able to see that actually, generally speaking, the industry's been pretty good at respecting those rulings. So we've also been able to sort of tell a positive story about the outcomes of that work in general, airlines are being respectful of those rules. So yeah, it's really sort of changed the way we think about our ability to regulate those kind of issues.
Really interesting. Really interesting. Can you give us some? I mentioned kind of alcohol and kind of inappropriate context. You've obviously spoken about airlines and climate. Can you give us some example of some of the other? I don't know whether it's fair to call them dodgier categories, but some of the other categories of advertising that you're assessing using the system, just to give our listeners, our viewers, a sense of, this isn't a few sectors. Actually, there's quite a lot going on here.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think we very much view this approach of quantitative intelligence as core to how we should be operating in the future. I used a phrase once in a meeting. I said, my goal for this year is to make data science boring at the ASA. So the idea is that it shouldn't be novel. It shouldn't be interesting that data science is part of a project of the ASA. It should just be the default. And so it's definitely, we're trying to apply these tools to everything. I mean, the phrase that I would talk in terms of sort of risk in terms of areas. I mean, and that risk comes in different forms. So we look at areas that are either high risk because there's intelligence that there's a problem. That might be, in some cases a small number of advertisers, but we've got some sense that there's an issue that we think we could improve levels of compliance in area, or areas where even though we don't necessarily think there's a problem, it's high risk because there's potentially a lot of harm. So, you raised alcohol. Obviously, that's the sector where you want to be very conscious that alcohol advertising is responsible because there's potential for harm if it isn't. So that's how we think about it in terms of what are the sort of the high risk areas, the high priority areas that the ASA is focusing on overall, where by providing better quantitative intelligence, better support, we can improve the quality of the regulation. Some examples, so things like alcohol, gambling. We did a lot of work on some new rules around the use of celebrities that appeal to under 18s. We've worked on topics like prescription-only medicines, promotion of e-cigarettes, Also supported some recent work on some rulings that were published on cosmetic surgery that takes place abroad and making sure that those ads are responsible as well. So, and many more, but generally speaking, a diverse list, but focused on the things that we feel are highest priority for the ASA system, the places where there's issues that we can make a difference to, basically.
Hello there, it's your host Sam here. Well, if you've been inspired by this conversation and want to find out what type of data storyteller you are, why not visit our scorecard at data-storytelling.scoreapp.com, complete 12 simple questions, and you'll instantly be served with a report telling you what type of data storyteller you are. Now, back to the action. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the work that influencers do, and I guess in part that might be whether or not they're even revealing they're being paid and using the hashtag ad and hashtag spawn and so on. But just before you do, on cosmetic surgery abroad, am I right in remembering from our earlier conversation that some organisations involved in this are kind of advertising this as a holiday? Go and get a Brazilian butt lift whilst you sun yourself on the beaches of.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, you can. I mean, there's an enforcement notice on the ASA website which lays out all the things that you should and shouldn't do if you're advertising cosmetic surgery. But generally speaking, the guidelines say things like you shouldn't trivialize the decision to have surgery. So you shouldn't describe surgery as a holiday. You know, even a relatively small cosmetic procedure is still a serious decision that somebody shouldn't take lightly and shouldn't go into without assessing the risks and making sure that it's the right decision for them. And yeah, we definitely saw examples of ads that used, either problematic phrases, problematic imagery that played on, body image issues, things like that definitely we took very seriously. And that's where that work came from. And that's been a big area of focus for us, trying to make sure that people aren't led into making serious decisions without the right information, basically, at the end of the day.
And in terms of your work with influencers?
Yeah, sure. So influencer marketing is a sort of a whole other sector for us. It's, traditionally, again, if you go back sort of 20, 30 years before influencers existed, the ASA was really focused on paid advertising, and we built up a whole load of processes around that. So this has been kind of an ongoing piece of work for the ASA to work out how to get to grips with influence marketing, how to be as effective in regulating it as we are in paid advertising. Big issue you highlighted is disclosure. We think we think it's important. I mean, it's also legally a requirement that if you're an influencer and you're advertising something, you're being paid to promote something, that you make it clear to consumers that it's a paid advert. Otherwise, people are misled into thinking this is simply an organic recommendation for a product, when in fact it's not. Somebody's being paid to promote something. Obviously, again, this is another thing that comes with the problem of scale. How many influencers are there in the UK? I don't know, but probably tens of thousands, maybe more than that, when you start to get into people sort of like have a particular niche, and all the different social media platforms that all have their own set of influence, their own sort of culture around it. So yeah, this is a challenge for us, is how do you monitor disclosure? Again, you have to start to bring some degree of AI and machine learning into this, because the amount of content is so huge. So it's another area we work on. We work very closely with the team, the compliance team that focus on this. And again, it's really about how do you help them focus down onto the problematic content more quickly. I think one thing I should probably emphasize through all of this is that we don't try to replace human decision-making through our use of AI at the ASA. Advertising regulation in particular is very nuanced. There's a sort of inherently, whether someone's misled or whatever the issue is, always comes down to how would someone seeing the ad perceive it. That's a very human question, right? That's very hard to answer there. And also, even as a human, quite hard to answer, because, how would someone who's different to you feel about it? How would they interpret it? Trying to get that diversity of views is a real challenge. So definitely what we don't try to do in our work with machine learning is somehow sort of magically replace that human expertise. So, in my previous example, I talked about cutting down the number of ads that we show so the experts can have a more tractable set to look through to make a decision. It's exactly the same with influence marketing. Influencers often produce huge amounts of content. A lot of it is them walking their dog, or making a birthday cake, or whatever it is. And then occasionally somewhere in there is slipped in, here's this product that I want to show you. So a lot of what we do is helping the teams that want to assess whether influencers are being compliant or not. So where we do quite targeted work, where when there's intelligence that suggests an influencer isn't following the rules, start to get some of their content and filter that down so the experts can see, here are some examples where they may have broken the rules, and then they can go in, assess that, try to put together a consistent picture, and go from there and decide what the best way forward is. But yeah, absolutely, it's another area where we find that the sort of the AI machine learning is indispensable, and to be honest, it has just become the new normal in terms of how we approach that, to the extent I think now, if we look back at how we worked before, we would think, well, in some ways that was obviously never going to succeed, in a sense. This is just essential in order to be an effective regulator.
Yeah, the prospect of keeping up with, and I only use this phrase to be gently playful, but keeping up with 10,000 Kardashians, and what they are and aren't disclosing would be one, soul destroying, and two it would bankrupt the advertising industry if you would need to do that. But I guess what is brilliant about the systems that you're building is that AI is kind of, apart from I guess data costs and the rest of it, is inexhaustible. You're not going to tire out the algorithm. The algorithm's going to carry on and on and on in a way that humans would have given up many times before. How close are you to having a real-time system operating at scale? Are you getting there?
I think yes. I mean,
does it even matter? I guess, to be real-time.
I mean, well, how real time you need to be, it depends. I think if you were to see an ad the next day, it's probably not that's probably good enough for the ASA. That's probably what we would consider pretty close to real time, and we're not there with everything yet. For a variety of reasons. I think for us, it's been a real process over the past 3 years. So when I joined, the first question in my mind is can we do this at all, right? Can we get it? Can we get the data? Can we turn it into something useful? And can we get someone to do something with it? And I think we convinced ourselves that yes, that's the case. We sort of, through that kind of agile experimentation process, we figured out, okay, these are the things that we can do. This is how they could work. And then there's been, since then, over the last year or two, there's been kind of this process of cementing that, working throughout the organization to work out how we change processes, where we need more resource in certain places to make use of the intelligence that we're generating, and also sort of trying to scale up. So, get better access to data, improve the infrastructure, and improve the coverage. So we started with small number of very narrow projects covering very small number of issues in particular sectors, particular challenges. Over time, we're expanding that out to cover more sectors, be more comprehensive in our coverage of how many issues we're looking for, what kinds of things we're doing, and also accelerate things, right? So go from, we check in on this occasionally when someone mentions they think there's a problem, up to ideally, yesterday someone started a new campaign, it has this in it that's really problematic and someone needs to take a look at it. Whether we'll get there for everything, I think, but it's an ongoing journey, basically. In some cases, we're getting there, but it's definitely not universal. I don't want to present a picture that we've sort of, we've got this magic AI system that sort of solved advertising regulation. It's not that at all, but it augments what the experts can do, and it's doing it in an increasing number of areas, increasingly close to real time, but it's going to be a long journey before we've done everything that we'd like to do with it, I think.
Brilliant. Yeah, you've clearly embraced automation, AI, machine learning much earlier than many organizations. I think there are some who believe that AI was invented in November 2022, right, as when ChatGPT came along. Was it? Which is clearly nonsense. But was it? Do you think it's your academic career, your time at CERN and so on that kind of gives you a head start? You've been doing this for 15 years.
I think. That's a really good question. I don't know. I mean, I think it's been really valuable for me to have had experience of different ways of working in different types of organization. The academic mindset, that kind of scientific curiosity, is definitely something that I've brought with me into industry. But equally, I think it's really valuable to have worked in a kind of more of a tech startup type environment. So you get a sense of, how to build something quickly from scratch, how to iterate quickly, how to be agile. And I think one of the great things about, ultimately, I think one of the things that I would say about the ASA is it's been a dream job from a data science perspective in that one of the biggest challenges when you speak to data science professionals is getting people to listen to what they've done, frankly, getting someone to care and do something with what they've done. And the ASA when I joined, both had a significant problem in the sense that it was struggling to get to grips with the scale of online advertising, but also had willingness up to the highest level, up to the board, to do something about it, and an acceptance that would require change as well, that it wasn't just a case of hire a couple of data scientists and you're done. So I guess it's, I don't want to take too much credit because I think organizationally, a lot of other people in the organization have done the right things and laid groundwork that's made it easy for me. But I do think, I think it's been really valuable to me. I think it's a great advantage of data to be able to work in different sectors, see different ways of working, and then bring all those ideas to where you are and say, well, I've got approaches that I think might work here, and be able to apply that. Yeah.
When you were talking earlier, we were talking about the sort of management data science. How do we bridge that gap? You suggested that one of the challenges there is that data science gives you answers that leaders don't necessarily want to hear. But I think when you talk about you bringing your academic curiosity, I mean, it's kind of been drummed into you from kind of day dot, I guess, that you're hypothesis testing rather than hypothesis proving. I think sometimes industry can find that a little bit challenging.
Yeah, and I think also as a sort of a statistician or someone from a stats background, you can't be too rigid about it either, right? Somehow, like being too purist either way is wrong, right? You've got to find the middle ground, and if often you can't measure the things that you really want to measure as well, right? So often the quantitative data doesn't give you the whole picture. I think you have to accept that as the numbers person, you still only have part of the picture, right? And so it's always a matter of finding the middle ground. I often find that also that it's funny. You say this thing about people don't want to hear what you have to say sometimes if it's not good news, but actually it's not that because they're being malicious. It's because it's I don't know. It's that they want to be optimistic about things. They like people like to feel that things are going well. And if you come to them and you say things aren't working out, everything you're doing is a waste of time, that's obviously always going to be a difficult message to hear, regardless of whether it's led by data or not. Anyone who comes to that, I think you've got to find a way to. You've got to sort of find a way to recognize that there's that you don't have the whole answer either as the data person, and so I don't find it hard. I think it's dangerous if as a data person you say, well, because I'm backed by numbers, I'm right and everyone else is wrong, right? I think the quantitative analysis is only ever one part of the picture as well. You have bits to learn also, I think.
Yeah, one of the I've got a diagnostic tool that I use with teams, both on the data science side and on really in any discipline. But one of the tropes that comes out time and again is that, and it's not always the case, but it does come out pretty often, that when challenged, those that work with numbers tend to rush to prove and bring more numbers out in order to try and make the point. And I've got a background in psychology. Cognitive Psychology 101 tells us, we can think of political examples. What the Leave campaign called Project Fear. You throw more and more data at people, and they become more entrenched in their view. So I think there's that middle way, that Aristotelian middle way, is definitely the way to go. Now, tell me, what is next for you and your team?
I mean, it's more of the same, frankly. We think we've got the outline now of how as a team, as an organization, AI, automation, machine learning can be at the core of the way we regulate. And I think it's going to be, we know we've still got a way to go on that journey to do it, to put in place a system of regulation that really makes the most of that, because it's almost once you see that you can. What we found is that once you see that you can do it, it suddenly opens your eyes to a whole set of possibilities. But that is, it's very. I really want to emphasize this, that the ASA, the technical part of what we've done in the data science team is only one part of the work. That it's very much been a process of, okay, you can tell us all this stuff. How do we use that to turn that into a more effective regulation? And it's a whole organizational transformation that requires. And I and it's in some ways it's frustrating, because you think, oh, why can't we go faster? I want to be done, with this, not because I want to leave or something, but just because you can see the benefit. But it's I think anyone who's worked on this kind of project in any organization knows that it's very hard, that it's a process of years of feeling out the right way forward, trying things, experimenting, getting the right processes in place, getting the right people in the right place to do these things. And so I think that's really the journey now for us, is we've shown that it can be done. Can we, I think my ambition is that we will be sort of, it's a bit of a cliche, but I'd like to think of us as being world leading in our application of AI, and us being able to sort of genuinely say, look, we've really done something genuinely impressive here in how we've transformed the way we regulate to take advantage of this technology, and that's delivering just much better results, much better protection for consumers, a much more level playing field for those legitimate businesses who do want to advertise. And, I believe that can happen in the next few years.
Fantastic. One of the things I'm inspired about, talking to you and talking to others on this podcast and elsewhere, is how data can be used to deliver really quite profound and deep purposes, which I think is unexpected to those who are maybe not so curious about data world. I'm also I'm interested in kind of bad actors, and I don't necessarily mean in the world of advertising at all. Throughout your career, have you got an example of the worst example of a misuse of data that you've come across? It might have been in the mountains of Switzerland, or just the worst misuse of data.
I think without naming names, I think I would say I've not seen many really maliciously bad uses of data. Like I said, I think in a lot of cases it's confirmation bias. It's people want to feel good about what they're doing, and so they've cherry picked some things and ended up with a very optimistic take on things. That's probably about time. But I guess the cases where I've seen. Well, the really worst cases I've seen are where data becomes sort of weaponized in sort of political disputes within an organization. I feel quite blessed not to be saying this about my current employer, but I've definitely seen situations where data is used almost to apportion blame. You find a data set that allows you to blame someone else for things not going the way that you want them to. So I think that's one of the maybe the most difficult situations I've found myself in previous roles is where you're sort of trapped in the middle of a battle, which is not really anything to do with data in the first place. And I best not to name names.
No problem. I completely appreciate that. I've got to have what I might call a Columbo question. Is there, in the way that you work with data, is there anything that I haven't asked you that you think I should have asked you?
Well, I mean, the big question in my mind is how is well, one of many big questions in my mind is how advances in AI are going to change the work of data scientists. I mean, frankly, what the work of an entry-level data scientist looks like today is very different to what it looked like sort of 10, 12 years ago when I was starting out. I remember, you mentioned, Qubit there, that role. We worked on a sentiment classification project there. And I remember we were working with Mechanical Turk to get thousands of examples labeled. It was sort of a 3-month research project to train the model. At the end of it, it was sort of, 70, 80% effective, something like that. And, that same thing, an entry-level data scientist could probably knock out something that works much better than that in a day using, large language models, right? The field has moved on enormously. Already at the ASA, we're experimenting with to what extent do AI-based agent-type approaches supplement the more traditional machine learning. It sounds funny to describe something as traditional machine learning when, 10 years ago, this was the revolution from sort of, more traditional statistical approaches. But now it's almost seems old fashioned. And even in the 3 years that you mentioned 2022 as the sort of the start of AI in many people's minds. Well, we started this journey before that, so in some ways, is the system that we've built already out of date and needs to be rewritten for sort of the new AI technologies that are available now? I think, it's just going to be fascinating to see how this evolves in the next few years. Are we now at a sort of a plateau where we're going to have a degree of stability and we're going to get a chance to really see how to integrate these techniques into our work? Or are we just at this point where things are going to continue to change, much greater capabilities becoming available to practitioners? If we are, then all bets are off. I've got no idea what the industry is going to look like in 5 years. But I think to me, that's one of the most interesting things that's happening at the moment in data science is that the tools at our disposal are expanding massively. While a lot of consumers see ChatGPT as a place to go and ask for information, the same technology is finding massive applications in data science, and it is going to change, the way companies work. I think it also enables smaller organizations to do much more. So things that would have been, like I mentioned, would have been a research project, taken a lot of time, 10 years ago, now potentially a few people with a few £1,000s can go off and build something very quickly. That changes the game for a lot of small organizations that wouldn't have been able to take this stuff on before, especially, people like us. We're not a huge organization, 120 people at the ASA with a data science team of 6 or 7. If you'd come to us 10 years ago and said, could you build this system? I would have said no. I would have said, give me 50 people and £10 million and maybe, and that just wouldn't have been feasible. So, I think you're going to see that leading to an acceleration of the type of people who can adopt these techniques as well over the next few years.
That's absolutely fascinating. Your talk of the sentiment analysis and for Qubit reminds me. I was involved in a team about the same time trying to do something, and again, I don't think we quite got up to 70%. But the amount of time and effort in order to get something that was pretty imperfect. And then I was having a chat with my son, who's he's studying. He's in his last year of psychology, doing statistical analysis, and his use of LLMs to help debug and write his code and saying, here's a data set, reorganize this data set. I talked to him about pivot tables, and he said, well, why would I use pivot tables when LLMs can just do this for me? There's no need for me to do that. And thinking back to my own sort of 20 years ago, getting my nails dirty in the data I was manually scraping from 8086 machines. Absolutely. So just to think about that, but in your area, I can absolutely see that. Now, finally, Adam, where can our listeners and our viewers find out about you, about your work, the ASA, what you're up to? Are you a social media user or online?
I think, we're often publishing stuff about what we're doing at the ASA. So yeah, you can keep track of our updates through our news. We have a newsletter you can sign up to, all of the usual social channels. And yeah, we do publish pieces about what we're doing through the active ad monitoring system reasonably regularly. So updates on specific industries where we've done work. There are pieces out there, for example, on the airline work that I mentioned earlier, prescription-only medicines, things like that. If you search for ASA active ad monitoring, you'll find lots more information.
Perfect. Well, in the show notes, I will include some links to some of those choice pieces. Thank you so much for your time, Adam. I think if there were any more people with your approach to using data smarter, there'd be rather less malarkey in the world of advertising regulation and rather more data-driven common sense. Adam Davidson, Head of Data Science for the ASA, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for listening to Data Malarkey. To find out what kind of data storyteller you are, why not take our data storytelling scorecard? It takes just 2 minutes to complete and will give you a personalized report right away. Visit data-storytelling.scoreapp.com or follow the link in the show notes.